I made a previous video on this mudroom bench, but now I need to make the middle portion the coat rack. I'm working with a 4x8 sheet of 5/8 inch MDF. I love MDF for trim projects. It's very easy to work with and has a nice smooth paintable surface. I'm cutting strips of it off, and for that I'm using my circular saw, which has a guide you can set to particular widths. A better way to cut MDF would be using a track saw, which I don't own, so this is the next best method for me. It can result in boards that have a little bit of curve to them if you didn't cut straight, in which case you have to take them over to your table saw and straighten them out. I need 3 different widths, a 4-inch, a 3.5 inch, and a 2.5 inch, and we'll see how those go together in just a minute. The width of my nook is about 47 inches, so I'll make a couple of those cuts and then we can get to assembling. So here we have the frame that's going to go on the back part of the wall. You could nail this frame directly to the wall, but depending on how flat your wall is, the joints may not be great, so I prefer to assemble it beforehand in one piece and then put it up. There are 2 cross pieces that I'm using solid wood for instead of MDF because these pieces are going to hold the coat hooks and MDF is not as structurally strong. To get the joints right, I need those wood pieces to be the same thickness as the MDF, 5/8 inch, so I'm running them through my planer a few times. There's not any one way to join these pieces together. You could use pocket screws, but I find that screws don't hold well in MDF, so I'm going to be using a biscuit joiner. You just mark the 2 sides of the joint that you're going to join. Then line up the biscuit joiner and it cuts a slot into the side of the piece. That slot holds a biscuit that we're going to glue in a little bit. So we repeat that process for every joint in the structure. When we're done, you just fill the slot with some glue and you put the biscuit in. And then you have to put some glue on the exposed sides of the biscuits as well. Then you just push the 2 pieces together and those biscuits help align all those joints. So when you're gluing, you want to clamp it up until it dries, but before you clamp, you need to make sure it's square. Best way to do that is to measure the 2 diagonals, make sure they're the same. If they're not, just give it a nudge in the right direction until they are. When it's square, just use some clamps to pull the joints tight. When you're gluing this many joints at once, it can be tricky to get them all pulled together and flush just right. And after I got it clamped up, some of the joints were not perfectly flat, so I went ahead and put spacer boards underneath and added hand clamps to particular joints. The next day, the joints are dry, take the clamps off. And then for any joints that have a little bit of gap, you can just use some wood filler. You want to get the wood filler as smooth as possible because you'd like to avoid sanding. MDF has a nice, smooth, paintable surface, and if you sand it, you can end up scuffing it. So here's the assembly process for the two side pieces. Similar deal as before, just getting them aligned, marking the joints with pencils, and then using a biscuit joiner to make the cuts. Then we add some glue and slot the biscuits into the joints and use some clamps to hold it tight. I went ahead and used spacer boards underneath this one so I could put hand clamps on each joint at the outset. If you don't have a really long clamp, you can use two shorter clamps and just link them up in the middle. And don't forget to measure the diagonals to check that it's square. And then here we are the next day. Glue is dry, clamps come off, and we have nice solid pieces that'll go up easily on the wall. So one way to finish a built-in would just be to paint the wall and the frame all your trim color. But I have this leftover fence wood from an earlier project, and I'm going to see if I can cut it down and use it as a decorative insert. This is one of the benefits to making the frame ahead of time instead of building it on the wall, is that I can do all this insert work in my garage. For these gaps where the fence boards don't come together, I'm just going to cut pieces of pine and then stain those to match the mudroom bench itself. One coat of primer and 2 coats of the trim color semi-gloss. For those center inserts, I'm using the same gel stain that I used for the bench. You put it on, let it sit for 4 or 5 minutes, and then wipe it down. This is how they came out, and then I top coated them with some wipe-on poly. Finally, time to put it up on the wall. I think it's a good idea to use construction adhesive when you put these things up. This is what I had on hand. Unfortunately, it was busted open, but I was still able to squeeze out enough to put behind all these MDF frames. For nailing, I'm aiming for the corners because I know there's studs there. And then I use this magnetic stud finder to find the studs in the middle of the wall and add a nail in those locations. You'll notice that the 2 side vertical pieces are a little bit wider than the center vertical piece. That's because these side pieces are going to cover up a little bit of that width, and then after those side pieces are in, they will all look uniform. There were no studs behind the side pieces, so for those I used a little extra construction adhesive. These fence board inserts are very lightweight and they're not going to bear any weight, so I did not use construction adhesive. For those, I just used a brad nailer. A few finishing touches, the caulk, fill the nail holes, touch up the paint on those, add the hooks, and yeah, the middle part of this is done. Next up is the cubbies at the top.